Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and look at a biological mystery that is going to completely change how you view nature. Because today, we're asking a question that sounds, well, kind of crazy. Do trees actually have a social network? We've spent centuries walking through forests just assuming we're essentially alone in them. We think the silence means absence, and because nothing visible is happening, we assume nothing is happening at all. But recent scientific discoveries are proving that every time you step into a forest, you're actually standing inside a system far older and far stranger than we ever imagined. To really wrap your head around just how strange this gets, consider this number, 400. In a forest in Switzerland, there is a beech tree that has been kept alive by its neighbors for over 400 years. Now, this tree is long dead. Its trunk is totally hollowed out. Its bark is rotted away. By every biological definition we have, it literally shouldn't exist anymore. But its root system is still connected to the surrounding trees. And for centuries, those neighbors have been quietly passing sugar and nutrients to it through an underground network, actively keeping the remains of their dead companion alive. And this brilliantly shatters what researchers call the passive forest myth. We usually think of trees as just passive scenery, right? They're just nature's furniture. They grow upward, they soak up sunlight, and they fall when they're cut down. But that dead stump in Switzerland proved the connection between those trees was never severed. The living trees are actively feeding the dead one. It completely upended the whole idea of trees as isolated, passive organisms, forcing biologists to stop using the word passive to describe them altogether. Which naturally leads us to a massive, seemingly unanswerable question. How on earth do trees communicate? When researchers first spotted this cooperative behavior, they were totally stumped. Trees don't have brains. They don't have nervous systems. There's zero obvious mechanism for sending or receiving information to one another. And yet, the biological observations just kept piling up, proving they were doing exactly that. Scientists had to figure out how they were sending and receiving all this data without a central nervous system. The first fascinating clue to this puzzle actually popped up back in the 1980s. Researchers in Africa noticed that when giraffes began eating the leaves of an acacia tree, the tree would respond by rapidly pumping up its tannins, making the leaves super toxic and bitter. But the real magic happened next. That damaged tree would release an invisible airborne chemical distress signal. Neighboring trees downwind would actually detect this cloud and preemptively beef up their own defenses before a single giraffe even touched them. Now, airborne warnings are incredibly cool, but they're really just the beginning. A warning system operating across an open landscape is amazing, but the truly mind-bending communication isn't happening in the air at all. The real mystery and the actual social network is operating entirely underground, completely out of our sight. Let's trace how this builds chronologically. The 80s gave us those airborne signals, but it was in the 1990s that forest ecologist Suzanne Simard fundamentally changed plant biology forever. She wanted to know if trees deliberately shared resources through a functional network, and not just by accidental root contact. So, she injected individual trees with radioactive carbon isotopes. She waited, and sure enough, the radioactive carbon traveled. And it didn't just move randomly, it moved in specific preferential patterns right into neighboring trees. What she discovered is now famously known as the Wood Wide Web. This radioactive carbon was traveling through a vast, highly functional network of mycorrhizal fungi that physically threads itself directly into the root systems of nearly every tree in the forest. It essentially creates a sprawling biological internet across the entire ecosystem. It wasn't just a discovery that a network existed, it was a revelation of exactly how it functioned to keep the forest alive. Through this network, Simard found that the oldest, largest trees, the ones with the deepest roots and the most sunlight, act as massive net exporters. Think of them as the main servers of this biological internet. Instead of just hoarding their resources, they push carbon and nutrients outward through the fungal network to smaller, shaded, struggling trees that just can't produce enough energy on their own. The oldest trees are actively feeding the youngest. She even identified what she called mother trees. These massive, highly connected hub trees do something genuinely incredible. They can actually distinguish their own genetic relatives through the underground network. And they use this ability to prioritize sending food and resources specifically to their own offspring over unrelated seedlings. They're actively regulating the flow of nutrients to ensure their own family line survives. So, a crucial point here is what happens when one of these highly connected trees reaches the end of its life. When a tree is diseased, drought-stressed, or damaged beyond recovery, it doesn't just quietly shut down and pass away into the background. It engages in a breathtaking, active process that researchers call the final bequest. Right before death, dying trees do something entirely unexpected. They dump all their remaining carbon reserves and energy directly into the network. They also blast out massive pathogen warning signals into the community. From a pure, self-interested evolutionary standpoint, this makes zero sense. A dying organism has no future reproductive opportunities, so why give away your energy? Yet this incredible final bequest happens consistently across multiple species, redistributing life back to the rest of the forest. And the scale of this underground communication is absolutely staggering. 30 meters. Using this fungal network, trees can actually trigger defensive responses in other plants up to 30 meters away. These are threats they couldn't possibly detect through the air or through direct physical contact. The network is carrying these complex warning signals way faster and across far greater distances than airborne chemicals ever could. Naturally, an incredible discovery like this has created a huge divide in the scientific community. On one side, you have researchers who view this purely as mechanical evolution. They argue the network is essentially just a passive transit pipe driven by natural selection. Forests with cooperative traits simply survived better, so no cognition is required. But on the other side, researchers see distributed intelligence. They argue that because hub trees regulate the system and the forest responds as a coordinated whole, it acts exactly like a single intelligent entity processing information. What researchers are truly confronting here is a profound, paradigm-shifting question. Does intelligence actually require a brain? This challenges our deepest, most fundamental biological assumptions about what constitutes a mind. We have always assumed that to process complex information and make adaptive decisions, you absolutely need a central nervous system. You need neurons. But let's look at the characteristics of the forest we've unpacked today. It processes information. It responds adaptively to environmental threats. It communicates. It recognizes kin, and it coordinates group behavior. If intelligence requires those abilities, then a forest does all of them perfectly, without a single neuron in sight. It really all comes down to a biological concept known as emergent complexity. This happens when simple components interact through a structured system to produce behaviors that none of the components could produce by themselves. Think about humans. A single neuron in your head cannot think. It has zero consciousness. But 100 billion of them, wired together in exactly the right way, produce a conscious human mind. The exact same principle applies to the forest as a superorganism. A single tree on its own cannot warn its neighbors about a drought. It cannot selectively feed its offspring, and it certainly can't consciously redistribute its life savings of carbon at the exact moment of its death. But an ancient, perfectly connected network of trees absolutely can. Evolution didn't need a brain to produce sophisticated behavior. It just needed enough time and the right network. Which brings us right back full circle to that 400-year-old dead beech stump in Switzerland. It makes perfect sense now, doesn't it? It isn't just some weird anomaly. It is a functioning piece of a massive superorganism that has been exchanging information, recognizing family, and caring for its weakest members since long before the first human being even looked up and wondered what a tree was. I want to leave you with this final thought. Whatever is happening in that forest, it began long before we arrived, and it will continue long after we're gone. The next time you take a walk through the woods, take a moment to look down. Ask yourself what invisible, ancient conversations are happening beneath your feet. Because you aren't just walking past passive scenery. If the ground beneath you is a living, breathing social network, what exactly are they saying about us?